Well, continuing our coverage of this Queensland decision and our analysis of what it does and does not actually mean in practice, I wanted to talk to someone from Victoria to get an idea of whether this precedent set in Queensland would have any utility in Victoria, given that Victoria also does have a Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. Well, who better to talk to than David Limbrick MP, who, if you'll cast your mind back, has been one of those people who was good on COVID, on lockdowns, on all of these issues all the way through. He's not wise in hindsight. He was wise at the time, and he joins us right now on the Aussie Wire. David, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I do want to kind of take a brief excursion back into the past before we talk about this decision. And I've grabbed this picture here, which was one of the iconic pictures that came out of the COVID lockdown era. This is yourself, David Limbrick MP, joined by your colleague Tim Quilty MP, sadly no longer an MP, but he was amazing at the time along with yourself. Now, tell us what's happening here and what was the point you were trying to make in this particular moment during the pandemic?
Yeah, what happened here was another mandate from the government, a direction to shut down the parks because mums were being naughty. This was during lockdowns and we had curfews at the time. And lots of mums on their sort of, at the end of their tether were going down to the parks and being sneaky and doing evil things like having a coffee and talking to friends and letting the kids play in the parks.
For shame.
So they closed down the parks and we said, that was nuts, and we ended up camping out the front of Parliament and causing a lot of trouble. And I think the government stood on a landmine with this one and ended up rescinding that order in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, well, I certainly didn't comply with that. I didn't used to take my kids to the park every day before they gave that order, but the minute they said I couldn't do it, we were heading down to 2 or 3 different parks every single day. My kids loved it. They thought it was the most fantastic time. Now, of course, this was right around the same time that the Victorian government also brought in a mandate for MPs to be vaccinated in order to come into Parliament House. The time when yourself and Tim Quilty, along with Catherine Cumming MP, went into the Parliament in exile. Tell us a little bit about what happened there.
Yeah, so the government issued vaccine mandates for workers, but one of the things that they discovered was a limitation of the emergency powers was they couldn't actually mandate it for federal workers, Parliament staff itself, and I think the judiciary. And so in order to do that, they had to put a motion through Parliament, because Parliament can make their own rules about themselves, to not allow MPs to take part in Parliament if they weren't vaccinated or refused to hand over their paperwork. Tim and I had been vaccinated, but we refused to hand over our paperwork. Mm-hmm. We were subsequently suspended from Parliament. And at the time, you could do Parliament, you could take part remotely. And so we did that from a nightclub, Chase Lounge in the city, which was great because, of course, they were closed at the time. Great nightclub, by the way. Mm-hmm. And so that we made a big deal about that. We ended up handing over our paperwork after that at the behest of many supporters because the very next sitting week of Parliament was the pandemic bill. And if we had been out of Parliament for that, we wouldn't have been able to fight it.
Yeah. No, look, I think you made some really courageous decisions through there to make points where they were there to be made and then to get on with business when the stakes were really that high. So I personally, coming from me, I applaud yourself and Tim and the way all of that was handled. Coming to this decision from the Queensland Supreme Court. Now, it is a bit of a mixed decision. Some people have gotten a bit too excited about the implications. Other people are simply trying to dismiss it and say that it really has no impact at all. From your perspective, you lived through all of those mandates that we just talked about and so many more that we don't have time to talk about. What's the significance from your perspective of this Queensland Supreme Court decision?
Look, I think there's good news and bad news with it. All of the mandates, as you say, in Victoria and Queensland were similar in that we have a Charter of Human Rights. If the government is going to limit one of those rights, then that limitation needs to be proportionate. And my argument all throughout the pandemic is that I wasn't convinced of the proportionality of many of these things, including school closures, vaccine mandates, lockdowns, all of that sort of stuff. I wasn't convinced of the proportionality of any of it. And that was my argument all along, was around proportionality, whether it's a proportionate response.
Yeah.
Now, the decision in Queensland, there's 2 aspects that they're looking at. One is the proportionality, and one is whether it was administered correctly. And unfortunately, the decision looks like they've accepted that a vaccine mandate was proportionate, which I'm very disappointed about that conclusion that they came to. But the reason that the mandate was considered to be unlawful was because the health minister at the time, the CHO at the time, didn't provide evidence to the court that they'd actually considered the rationale for limiting that right. And the right under Victorian law, it's Section 10C of the Charter, which is the right to freedom from medical treatment without full and free consent. And Queensland has a very similar right. I can't remember the exact number it is in their charter, but that's a really important right. We have since done a lot of discussion about this in Victoria, and if you compare to international treaties like the UN Convention on the Charter of Human Rights, this particular right cannot be limited under international covenants. And so what we've actually already done in Parliament, and it's sitting on the notice paper in the Legislative Council, we put forward a private member's bill which makes it impossible to limit that right in any way whatsoever, which would actually have fixed this problem if that bill was active and was law. But I'm disappointed that the proportionality is a problem. So what does that mean for Victoria? If Victoria was not considering the human rights assessments, the human rights impacts, then it would be unlawful in Victoria. The problem is, I think that they actually were doing that work. In fact, I spoke with the CHO many times about it in my time on the Public Accounts and Estimates Committee. So I think that if a similar challenge under similar grounds was done in Victoria, it would probably be unlikely to find them unlawful, which I take no pleasure in saying that.
No.
But I think that's the reality. Yeah.
And we're not saying that we agree with the decision. We're simply trying to be honest about what the decision does or does not say. But I want to come back to this procedural aspect of it, because there is a particular test that I actually discussed with Tim Quilty when he was an MP during the pandemic in real time. I did a podcast with him, and I have some questions, having carefully read the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities myself as well. There is, of course, a provision, there's a clause in there that says that certain rights can be limited when they come into conflict with each other. And I think that that's a key phrase that has yet to be tested in court. What was the human right within the Charter that was in conflict with the human right to be free of medical coercion? And I think that's a very difficult argument to make. As I've discussed it with a few different legal people, they tend to fall back on the right to not be infected with an infectious disease. But of course, there is no such right. And if we were to imply such a right, then that means that every single childcare centre is now a flagrant human rights violator. There's all kinds of novel problems that come up when you start to infer these previously non-existent human rights. So I don't think this is game, set and match. I don't think this is game over. I think there are arguments that have yet to be run here. I want to come back, though, to the impact of this decision, because regardless of the details of it, certainly it's been viewed by many, including Dr. Nick Coatsworth, who was on Sunrise just yesterday morning, talking about the fact that, in fact, the very first thing he said was, I want to acknowledge the role that I played in these vaccine mandates, and he was doing that by way of acknowledging that actually, according to this decision, he had been wrong. So regardless of the details, this decision is still going to have an impact, both at an official level and at a public perception level. Where do you think we're at with that? Do you think the public are coming around to the point where they're at least willing to acknowledge that perhaps we went too far?
Look, I think that there's a lot of people like that. I think a lot of people dug into their positions at the time. Maybe these, when you were talking about the conflict of rights, I think that's a really good discussion to have. And the conflict that they were looking at was the right to life, which is, the right of other people to not be harmed. Now, early on with the vaccines, people sort of assumed that they would prevent transmission, and maybe you could have made an argument, under that sort of science. But as we soon learnt, that it doesn't really prevent transmission much at all, and therefore that argument totally fell away. But people had already dug into their position, and they were very reluctant to move away from that. So I think that there are people moving away from the idea that we should have mandated these things, and I think that the harms of not necessarily deaths and things, but harms to things like, I've spoken to lots of women who've had problems with menstrual cycles and stuff like this due to vaccines. I think a lot of people are talking to their friends and realizing that, there was these other harms that weren't really considered. And a lot of people maybe feel bad about what happened and the way that it went down.
It's going to be interesting times for sure. We did see a decision out of New Zealand finding that vaccine mandates were unlawful. We've now seen a decision, a mixed decision to be sure, but a decision nevertheless that the vaccine mandates were on a technicality unlawful. That's going to have a tremendous impact for those who are still being denied their ability to work, etc., up in Queensland. And slowly we are seeing the needle turn. David, this is a challenging time because we're now trying to ask people that, as you say, dug into decisions that are now looking more and more questionable as time goes on. We're asking them to start to take some honest assessments of that. What's the pathway that you see towards any kind of justice, any kind of outcome where there might be some sort of an official acknowledgement, some sort of an official apology? We know in the past it's taken decades for governments to apologise for areas where they've flagrantly abused people's human rights. There were incidents with the gay community early on that took decades for the government to apologise for. There were issues with thalidomide that took decades. Are we on the same path here? Is it going to be decades before this really gets any official acknowledgement?
Look, I hope it's not decades. I think one of the important things is that I think that we need to provide people a pathway to change their position on these things. I think that one of the mistakes of many people, and maybe I'm guilty of this mistake as well, is sort of locking people with a different position into that and sort of not giving them a pathway to change to our position or to reassess the way that they were thinking. And so I think that that's really important. And I think it was really good what Dr. Coatsworth did in, providing a model for that pathway, right, in some ways.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important for us to do that and bring people along for the journey rather than sort of have this polarization still, which we had all the way throughout the pandemic. I don't think it's helpful to sneer at people who supported the mandates and things like that. Like, many people did support them in good faith and thought that it was the right thing. And I think that we shouldn't demonize these people for those decisions, or for those, especially members of the public.
Yeah.
We should give them a pathway to change their position.
Yeah. Well, certainly I'm hopeful that this decision, regardless of the mixed nature of it, is going to be continuing a pathway towards official acknowledgement of the wrongdoing. We'll have to wait and see. In the meantime, David Limbrick, MP, thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Thanks for having me.